Hey guys, welcome to part two. Sorry, I wasn't keeping track of my time on the previous recording. So I'm just going to go back again and just quickly highlight corrections. Some of the things that we need to address are public versus private prisons. And a lot of that is discussed in chapter 12 on pages 318 to 320. While most correctional facilities are public, there are some private. You will tend to find private at the state and federal levels. You won't find too many private county jail systems. So a lot of times it's at the state and federal level. Sometimes it's to save money. But just know that there's always been this public versus private debate. Typically in private prisons, you'll find your low-level offenders are housed there, not necessarily your more serious offenders, those with criminal history, significant criminal history in crimes against persons, for example. But read about that so you have some ideas to what exactly some of the nuances are between public and private prisons and institutions. The other thing that you need to address is jurisdiction based on local, state, and federal. So county jails are local. State prisons are a state function, and federal prisons obviously are a federal function. So if you commit a crime in your community that is a misdemeanor, or the judge, it's a low-level felony and the judge sentenced you to county jail, you're going to do time at the county jail level, which means it's going to be local. So typically you're there for less than 1 year, maybe 6 months, whatever the judge elects to do. Obviously, state prisons run the gamut from anything over a year up to execution. So depending on your state and the facility that you're housed in, again, you're committing a state crime. Federal prisons house federal prisoners, those who have committed some federal crime in the U.S. Okay, so for example, the Boston Marathon bomber, the brother that was apprehended, he's at a federal corrections facility. The Unibombers at a federal correctional facility. Some terrorists are housed at federal correction facilities. So bank robbers are housed at federal correctional facilities. So just so you have an understanding as to the jurisdictional issues, okay? So state prisons are a state function, county jails, local function, and then obviously federal prisons are a federal function. And again, jurisdiction. You're not going to find federal prisoners in county jails unless they're there for other reasons, for another court case or something like that. But in terms of punishment, you're not going to find a federal prison in county jail, and so forth. All right, so read about that, know the nuances and differences between the two. Finally, it's to look at discretion, and much like in law enforcement, correctional officers have discretions. Again, remember, discretion is the ability to decide to do something multiple ways. So in the correctional environment, it could be something like when to write an email up for an infraction. In terms of community corrections, it's, how do you deal with somebody who breaks curfew, for example, if you're a probation officer, things like that. So you have some level of discretion because clearly you can't write every inmate up for every infraction. So just know that we need to use that discretion judiciously. Again, as with law enforcement, there are certain circumstances in which use of discretion is controlled through correctional institutional policies and procedures, and there's instances where correctional officers have some latitude in how they're going to deal with problems that they confront on a daily basis. All right, so that's the issue of discretion. So it's discussed in your textbook as well, so just make sure you take a look at that. So how do they function together chronologically is what we're talking about next in terms of the components of the criminal justice system. So you could look at it in terms of police, courts, and corrections. Where obviously the police investigate crime, they collect evidence to identify suspects, they make an arrest, all while adhering to the rule of law and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. All right, so evidence is collected, but it needs to be collected in a way that it's admissible in court. If you collect evidence that's inadmissible, then it's not going to be allowed in the court hearing. And so that's one of the goals, is to make sure that the evidence is obtained in a constitutional protected way. In other words, we're protecting the rights of the suspects, but at the same time, we're collecting that evidence. So maybe it's a situation where you need to get a search warrant, or maybe it's one of the exceptions where you were able to collect some evidence. But whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that it's done following the rule of law and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all that's afforded to citizens of the country. Next would be the courts. Now, the courts includes the district attorney's office. Now, the district attorney's office may work closely with police investigators on serious crimes such as homicides or things like that. And in some jurisdictions, that's how it works. If you have a homicide, a district attorney may come out and oversee the investigation, be there as a resource in terms of getting a search warrant or whatever the case may be. All right, so the DA plays a pivotal role. He's a definite resource for law enforcement and helps them, whether it's drafting a search warrant or getting an arrest warrant or whatever the case may be. The DA serves that critical role. And the DA also determines what charges are going to be filed. All right, so he's going to look at the police report, he's going to look at the evidence. In some cases, you use the DA's office will issue a complaint. In some states, it's a little bit different. But nonetheless, they have a significant influence in terms of their role in this chronological process. So the police, once they've investigated the case, they've arrested somebody, they can then take their investigation to the district attorney's office to seek charges against an individual, and then the DA is going to review that and determine what charges to file, right? And then he's going to look at, the key issues, the legal issues in terms of other evidence, suspect statement, make sure that those are all done in a constitutional way so he can evaluate what needs to take place. Because remember, the DA has to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. The police only need probable cause to arrest somebody for an offense. Proving something beyond a reasonable doubt is a much higher standard of proof than probable cause, right? Finally, the courts, the courts are the neutral arbitrator. Their job is to ensure that the defendant's rights haven't been violated, that the police use proper tactics in collecting evidence. The court determines what evidence is going to be admitted, what evidence is not going to be admitted. Sometimes the DA might want to try to introduce evidence of a previous offense that matches this one to show the defendant's behavior. In other words, this just isn't the first one. So those are legal issues that the courts have to decide. So the court has a very pivotal role in, again, going back to this issue of the rule of law, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and its applicability to the court process. Corrections, the final element here is once an individual has in fact been convicted of a crime and the judge has sentenced that individual to some punishment, then it's corrections responsibility to administer the punishment determined by the court. Its goal is obviously to protect society and to rehabilitate offenders. And so when we talk about corrections, we could talk about probation, which is where you may serve a minimal amount of jail time, not prison time, typically jail time if you go on probation, followed by an extended number of years, maybe a year, 2, 3 years on probation, in which you're supervised, right? Otherwise, you may be sent to county jail or state prison, right? So there's an array of things that take place here. But again, the ultimate responsibility for corrections in this is to protect society one way or the other, either through monitoring if someone's on probation or incarceration at the state prison, depending on the offense. And then obviously the ultimate underlying goal should be the rehabilitation of the offender, because once the offender is released from prison, we don't want him to come back. So he needs to learn some skill sets or some level of behavioral change in order not to be or reoffend. So there are some options available to the court: probation, fines, county jail, state prison, an array of punishment that the courts have. So that's what corrections responsibilities are. Finally, we're going to look at technology. and you're going to look at technology in the context of the criminal justice system, how the three components of the criminal justice system use technology to promote transparency with the public. So transparency with the public, again, with the police, you could use body camera. You can talk about drones if you want, not necessarily if you're looking at transparency, but again, all of this technology has issues of privacy associated with it. So you need to make sure that you have policies in place to demonstrate your transparency. In other words, you're using this not to spy on people, but for effective law enforcement investigations and so forth. So you can take a look at police and technology on pages 188 to 193. The courts are outlined on page 248 to 250. Again, more of a paperless environment where you can actually access information online. A lot of legal documents are posted online. Video conferencing a hearing for initial appearances and so forth. A lot of states have been using this for some time. But in light of this COVID-19 pandemic, you're beginning to see the court use a lot more of these video conferencings in certain steps in the criminal justice system to keep the process moving and to ensure people have their constitutional rights protected. Corrections, you could take a look at that on page 323 to 325. Again, with the COVID-19, you're beginning to see corrections use virtual visits where things are done over the internet, much like you and I might FaceTime with a friend. Using these virtual visits will allow inmates to maintain that connection to their family while they're incarcerated. There's also offender programming and management techniques that are used. But again, these are all processes that the courts, that criminal justice professionals use to promote some level of transparency. But again, policies and procedures need to be, especially for a lot of these technological equipment, some of these should be made, these policies should be made available to the public so they can understand how they're to use, how they're going to be used and not used. Same with body cameras. You don't want everything released to the public because you may be dealing with a crime victim who's been a victim of a sexual assault. And so that type of images captured on the body cameras should not be available to the public. Many people argue because it's a privacy issue. So you're weighing that public need versus privacy, right? So you can take a look at these, and I've outlined the pages for you. And then finally, make sure you include at least one source so I can evaluate your ability to cite and reference sources using APA format. Again, as I mentioned before, your textbook is always an awesome, awesome source to use. It's simple, straightforward. Textbooks are easy to reference. So if you can, use the textbook, right? I think that's it, guys. So hopefully this helps. If not, if you have any questions, just let me know. And have a good week, and I look forward to reading your projects. Thanks, bye.